Christmas Eve. A packed auditorium. Orphaned children about to sing. A powerful man sitting in the front row, bored, merely fulfilling a social obligation. But when the stage lights come on and he sees that face among the small singers, something inside him shatters. A face that shouldn't be there. A face he knew. A face carrying an impossible secret, capable of destroying everything he had built, or saving him from the darkness consuming him. This is a story about destinies that cross when we least expect it, about buried truths that always find the light, and about how a single moment can change two lives forever. Snow was falling heavy over Manhattan that Christmas Eve of 2023. The streets of Fifth Avenue sparkled with decorative lights, and the sound of bells echoed between the skyscrapers. But for Richard Hartwell, CEO of Hartwell Global Investments, all that festivity was nothing more than a necessary annoyance. At 52 years old, Richard was one of the richest and most feared men in New York. His fortune exceeded $2 billion, built with an iron fist and ruthless decisions. Divorced for 8 years, childless, he lived alone in an 8,600 square foot penthouse on the Upper East Side, where the silence was as vast as his bank account. That night, Richard drove his black Mercedes-Benz S-Class through the icy streets toward Lincoln Center. Not because he wanted to. Never because he wanted to. His presence at the St. Catherine Orphanage Christmas concert was purely strategic. Margaret Ashford, the institution's director and wife of an influential senator, had practically begged for his participation. "It would be so meaningful to have someone of your caliber supporting our cause," she had said with that perfect political smile. Richard knew the game. Show up, fake interest, sign a generous check, and score points with the right people. Simple as that. No emotions. No real involvement. Exactly how he liked to live. Geffen Hall was surprisingly full when he arrived. Entire families occupied the seats, excited children held colorful programs, and the air smelled of hot chocolate and anticipation. Richard felt a tightness in his stomach. He hated crowds. He hated noise. He hated, above all, that fake Christmas cheer. "Mr. Hartwell, what an honor to have you here." Margaret Ashford appeared like a whirlwind of expensive perfume and exaggerated enthusiasm. She guided him to the front row, right in the center, where it would be impossible to leave discreetly. Richard forced a polite smile and sat down, already calculating how long he'd have to endure this. Around him, parents chatted animatedly, took photos, adjusted scarves on their children. A girl of about 5, sitting with her mother right behind him, wouldn't stop asking questions. "Mommy, are the orphan children sad? Don't they have anyone to give them Christmas presents?" Richard felt something strange in his chest. Irritation, probably. Or maybe discomfort. He checked the Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. 7 o'clock. The program said the concert would last an hour. 1 hour and he could leave. The lights went out. A respectful silence took over the auditorium. Then, slowly, the red stage curtains began to open. What Richard saw made him frown. About 40 children, organized in 4 semicircular rows, all dressed in white and blue clothes. Boys and girls of varying ages, from 5 to 16 years old. Some smiled nervously, others looked too serious for their age. Orphans. All of them. Margaret Ashford took the stage with a microphone. "Good evening, everyone. On behalf of St. Catherine Orphanage, I deeply thank you for your presence. Tonight is special for our children. For many of them, this will be the only Christmas event they'll have. And they've prepared something beautiful for all of you." Polite applause echoed. Richard clapped his hands mechanically, 2, 3 times. He was about to settle into his seat with the resignation of someone watching a tedious business meeting when it happened. The children began to position themselves for the first number. And it was then, in that movement of small bodies searching for their places, that Richard saw. In the second row, a little to the left of center, a boy of approximately 9 years old adjusted the collar of his white shirt. Brown hair, straight, falling slightly over his forehead. Fair skin, with some freckles on his nose. And then the boy turned his face toward the audience, looking for someone in the crowd. Richard felt his blood freeze in his veins. No. It wasn't possible. That face. Those eyes. The jawline. The shape of the eyebrows. It was like looking into a mirror from the past. It was like seeing himself at 9 years old. But that wasn't what was destroying him inside at that moment. What made his heart beat wildly, what made his hands tremble and his throat close wasn't the physical resemblance. It was the recognition. He knew that face. Not as a vague memory, not as a casual similarity. He knew that boy. Or should know him. Or. Richard's mind went into panic. Memories he had buried years ago began exploding in his head like bombs. A woman. A hospital. An impossible choice. A decision he made and never looked back. Until now. No, he whispered to himself, so low that no one around him heard. It can't be. But it was. Deep in his being, somewhere he had locked away 7 keys ago, almost a decade ago, Richard knew exactly who that boy was. And this truth was capable of completely imploding the life he had built on lies and silences. The children began to sing Silent Night, their angelic voices filling every inch of the auditorium. But Richard heard nothing anymore. His eyes were fixed on that brown-haired boy, who sang with a serious expression, almost melancholic, as if carrying a burden too great for someone so young. And perhaps he did. Richard needed to get out of there. Needed to breathe. Needed to think. But his legs wouldn't move. It was as if an invisible force kept him glued to that seat, forcing him to face what he had run from for so long. The music continued, sweet and cruel, while the snow outside fell harder, as if the sky itself was crying for the truths about to be revealed. The concert continued, but for Richard Hartwell the world had stopped turning. His hands gripped the armrests with such force that his knuckles were white. Cold sweat dripped down his temple despite the auditorium's freezing air conditioning. The boy kept singing. His voice was clear, in tune, but there was something in it that cut deeper than any melody. Something that made Richard's heart beat irregularly, as if his body recognized a truth his mind still refused to accept. Richard forced himself to look at the other singers, desperately trying to convince himself he was going crazy, that this was just an absurd coincidence. But always, inevitably, his eyes returned to that brown-haired boy in the second row. "Don't be ridiculous," Richard ordered himself. "It's just a child. Any child. You're seeing things that don't exist." But deep in his chest, something screamed otherwise. The music changed to "O Holy Night," and the children's voices filled the auditorium with a purity that made people around Richard pull tissues from their pockets. A lady to his right cried discreetly. A man behind him cleaned his glasses, clearly moved. Richard couldn't feel anything but panic. He needed to find out who that boy was. He needed answers. But at the same time, a part of him, the cowardly part that had always won in his life, wanted to flee before it was too late. Before the truth, whatever it was, caught up with him. When the music ended, Margaret Ashford returned to the stage, her smile radiant. "Wonderful. Simply wonderful. I know many of you are curious about our little singers, so we've prepared something special." Richard felt his stomach turn. Each child will introduce themselves briefly and share a bit of their story. After all, this is a night of hope, of second chances, of Christmas miracles. "No," Richard thought. "Please, no." Margaret gestured to the first row of children. "Let's start with our youngest. Emily, dear, can you begin?" A girl with blonde curly hair, no more than 6 years old, stepped forward. Her voice was shy, almost inaudible. "My name is Emily. I'm 6 years old. I like to draw." Polite applause. The next child. And the next. And the next. Richard barely heard. His body was tense like a rope about to snap. With each child who introduced themselves, he got closer to that moment. The moment when the brown-haired boy would speak. And then it was his turn. "Ethan," Margaret called with a gentle smile. "Come on, dear." Ethan. The name hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. It wasn't a common name. It wasn't just any name. It was. Memories exploded in his head. Fragments. Flashes. A conversation. A woman laughing. A voice saying, "If I ever have a son someday." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block the memories. But they came in waves, relentless. Ethan walked to the center of the stage. Under the spotlights, his resemblance to Richard was even more disturbing. The shape of his face. The jawline. Even the way he walked, with his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. "My name is Ethan," the boy said, his voice clear but contained. "I'm 9 years old. I came to live here 6 months ago." Richard could barely breathe. 9 years old. 6 months ago. When was the last time he had thought about, no. He couldn't go down that path. Not now. Not here. "I like to read," Ethan continued, his eyes scanning the audience without really focusing on anyone. "And math. I want to be an engineer when I grow up." Something inside Richard broke. He also liked math at that age. Also dreamed of building things, creating solutions, solving impossible problems. "Stop," he ordered himself. "You're creating connections that don't exist. Coincidences. Just coincidences." But then Ethan said something that made Richard's world collapse. "My mom always said I was too smart for my own good." A shadow passed over the boy's face. She's not here anymore. That's why I'm at ASSISTE. Catherine. The silence that followed was broken only by muffled sobs from some people in the audience. Richard was motionless, petrified. "My mom is not here anymore." The words echoed in his mind, each syllable an accusation, a sentence, a condemnation. "Thank you, Ethan," Margaret said gently, placing her hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're very brave." Ethan returned to his place in the row, and the presentation continued. More children. More stories. More tears from the audience. But Richard saw nothing more. Heard nothing more. His mind was somewhere else. In another time. 10 years ago. A woman. An argument. A choice he made. A choice he never looked back from. Until now. When the concert finally ended, the audience rose in ovation. Parents hugged children, took photos with the orphanage children, chatted animatedly with Margaret about adoption processes. Richard remained seated, unable to move. Margaret eventually approached him, the smile still plastered on her face. "Mr. Hartwell, what did you think? Aren't our children extraordinary?" Richard forced himself to stand, his legs trembling. "Yes. Extraordinary. Would you like to meet some of them personally? Many of our donors like to." "That boy," Richard interrupted, his voice coming out hoarse. "Ethan, you said he's been here for 6 months." Margaret blinked, surprised by the direct question. "Yes. Poor child. He arrived in June, right after his mother passed away. Cancer, according to the records. He had no one else. No father, no close family. No father." The words pierced Richard like knives. Is he a difficult child?" Richard asked, hating himself for each word, but unable to stop. "Oh, no. Ethan is wonderful. Quiet, polite, extremely intelligent. But..." Margaret hesitated. "He has nightmares. Cries during the night. Our psychologist says he's still processing the loss. And there's something else." "What?" Richard asked too quickly, too eagerly. Margaret looked at him with curiosity, but continued. "He asks questions about his father. Constantly. His mother apparently never told him who he was, only said that he couldn't be present. Ethan has this fantasy that maybe his father doesn't know he exists, that if he knew, he would come get him." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "We try to explain that sometimes parents have reasons, that things aren't always simple, but... Margaret sighed. He's just a child. He wants to believe that someone is out there, looking for him. In that moment, through the crowd, Richard saw Ethan. The boy was alone near the stage, watching the other children interact with visitors. His eyes scanned the auditorium, searching for something. Or someone. And then, for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. Richard saw something in the boy's face. Recognition, hope, or just the imagination of a desperate man trying to find meaning where there was none. Ethan looked away first, returning his attention to the floor. Mr. Hartwell. Margaret called. Are you feeling all right? You look pale. Richard turned abruptly. I need to go. I'm sorry. And before Margaret could respond, before anything could stop him, Richard Hartwell fled that auditorium as if his life depended on it. Because maybe it did. Outside, the snow fell even harder, and Richard leaned against the cold wall of the building, struggling to breathe, struggling to think. No father. Nightmares. Questions. And a truth he could no longer deny, no matter how hard he tried. That boy was his. And he had abandoned him. Richard drove through the streets of Manhattan like a possessed man. The snow made visibility almost zero, but he barely noticed. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, his breathing came out in irregular bursts. Run. Just run. You're good at that. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how many blocks he left behind, he couldn't escape that boy's face. Those eyes. That expression of abandonment he recognized very well. Because he had seen it before. In the mirror. When he was 9 years old. Richard parked in front of his penthouse on the Upper East Side and entered quickly, leaving a trail of snow across the Italian marble floor. The silence of the apartment enveloped him like a shroud. 8,600 square feet of absolute luxury, and no sound except his own labored breathing. He went straight to the bar, pouring 3 fingers of 50-year-old Scotch whiskey. He drank it in one gulp, feeling the liquid burn his throat. He poured again, and again. But the alcohol didn't erase the images. Didn't silence the questions. Ethan Brennan. 9 years old. No father. Richard walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park covered in snow. Outside, the city sparkled with Christmas lights. Families were probably gathering at that moment. Presents being opened. Laughter. Love. Things he never had. Things he never wanted. Or did he want them and simply didn't know how to reach them? His mind went back, against his will, to that day. 10 years ago. The day Sarah Brennan walked into his office and changed everything. Richard closed his eyes, and the memories came with full force this time. He could no longer block them. Sarah was 28 years old when they met. Financial consultant at a smaller firm that eventually partnered with Hartwell Global. She was different. She wasn't intimidated by him. Didn't flatter. Openly disagreed when she thought he was wrong. And he had fallen in love with that. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Hartwell allowed himself to feel something beyond ambition. It was 6 intense months. Dinners that extended until dawn. Conversations about everything and nothing. She made him laugh. She made him think. She made him want to be better. But Richard didn't know how to be better. He only knew how to be powerful. When Sarah showed up pregnant, he panicked. Complete and absolute panic. His father had been a bitter and cruel man, who turned Richard's childhood into a hell of impossible expectations and severe punishments. Richard had sworn he would never be a father. That he would never risk becoming the monster his own father was. So he did what he always did when confronted with something he couldn't control. He bought a way out. $2 million. Signed documents. Renunciation of all parental rights. Sarah left his office that day with a check and eyes full of tears that haunted him for weeks. Until he buried the memory. Locked it away somewhere deep in his mind and threw away the key. Until that night. Richard opened his eyes abruptly, returning to the present. The whiskey glass trembled in his hand. She died. Margaret had said. Cancer. And Sarah raised that boy alone. Worked, fought, sacrificed everything. And never told him about his father. Never said that Richard Hartwell, billionaire, was out there somewhere, living in obscene luxury while she and his son. No, Richard said aloud to the empty apartment. I didn't know. I had no way of knowing. But it was a lie. He knew. He always knew Sarah had gotten pregnant. He just chose not to care. Chose money, power, control instead of what? Responsibility. Family. Love. His phone rang, tearing through the silence. Richard looked at the screen. Margaret Ashford. He considered not answering. Considered throwing the phone out the window. But his hand, betraying his desire to flee, answered. Mr. Hartwell. Margaret's voice sounded concerned. Sorry to bother you on Christmas Eve, but you left so abruptly that I was worried. Is everything all right? I'm fine, Richard lied, his voice coming out harsher than intended. Great. Look, I know it was an emotional night, but I wanted to take advantage while I still have your attention. Margaret paused. You showed particular interest in Ethan. Richard's heart raced. I didn't. You don't need to deny it, Margaret said gently. I've been an orphanage director for 15 years. I recognize when someone makes a connection with a child. And frankly, Ethan needs a miracle. What do you mean? Richard asked before he could stop himself. He's been here 6 months and no one has shown interest in adopting him. He's too quiet, too introspective. People want smiling, outgoing children. Ethan is complicated. But he's a special boy, Mr. Hartwell. Incredibly intelligent. Just lost. Lost. Like Richard had been. Like he still was. Why are you telling me this? Richard asked. Because I saw how you looked at him. And I know you can make a difference in his life. If you want to, of course. We can schedule a visit. No commitment. Just to get to know him better. Richard should say no. Should hang up the phone, block Margaret's number, forget all of this and return to his perfectly controlled life. But the words that came out of his mouth were different. When? Tomorrow? Christmas Day. We don't normally do visits on holidays, but I know you're a busy man. And it would be special for Ethan. Most of the children receive visits from family members tomorrow. He'll be alone. Alone. On Christmas. While other children laughed and opened presents. What time? Richard heard his own voice ask, as if it belonged to someone else. 2 in the afternoon? I'll be there. Richard hung up before Margaret could respond, before he himself could change his mind. He looked at the reflection in the window. A 52-year-old man, alone in an $8 million apartment, on Christmas Eve, about to make the most insane decision of his life. Meet a boy who could be his son. A boy he abandoned before he was even born. A boy who had looked him in the eyes in that auditorium and seen. What? A stranger? A hope. A father. Richard poured more whiskey, his hands shaking violently now. Outside, the bells of a nearby church began to toll midnight. Christmas had arrived. And Richard Hartwell, the man who never believed in miracles, in second chances, in redemption, was about to discover if some burned bridges could be rebuilt. Or if some choices were simply too late to undo. The snow continued to fall over Manhattan, covering sins and secrets under a white blanket of possibilities. And somewhere on the other side of the city, in a silent orphanage, a 9-year-old boy was probably also awake, looking out the window, wishing for a miracle that never came. Not yet. Richard didn't sleep that night. He sat in his Italian leather armchair, looking at the illuminated city, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ethan's face. Heard that voice saying, "My mom is not here anymore." At 6 in the morning on Christmas Day, he gave up trying to rest. He took a cold shower, trying to clear his mind. He put on casual clothes, jeans and a navy blue cashmere sweater, something he never wore. Richard Hartwell always wore suits. Always kept his armor on. But today he didn't know who he was trying to be. At 8 in the morning, he was in a toy store on Madison Avenue that opened early for last-minute customers. He walked through the lit aisles, completely lost. What would a 9-year-old boy like? Video games? Books? Toys? A saleswoman approached, smiling. "Can I help you? Looking for something for your son?" The word hit Richard like a punch. Yes. 9 years old. He likes to read. And math. The saleswoman guided him to a section of science kits and educational books. Richard bought an advanced robotics kit, 3 books about astronomy, and, at the last moment, a chess set in fine wood. "Gift wrap?" the saleswoman asked. Richard looked at the items. Wrapping meant intention. Meant this was real. That he was actually doing this. "Yes," he said. "Please." At 2 in the afternoon, Richard parked in front of ASSISTE. Catherine Orphanage in Brooklyn. The building was an old red brick construction, with tall windows and a small tower with a bell. Fresh snow covered the front yard, where someone had built a crooked snowman. Richard held the wrapped presents and took a deep breath. His hands were shaking. When was the last time he felt fear? Real, visceral, paralyzing fear? Maybe never. Margaret Ashford received him at the door, her warm smile contrasting with the coldness Richard felt inside. "Mr. Hartwell, what a joy to see you. And you brought presents, how kind." "Where is he?" Richard asked, straight to the point. He couldn't make small talk. "Not today. Ethan is in the library. He practically lives there." Margaret guided him through hallways decorated with children's Christmas drawings. Children's voices echoed from somewhere in the building, laughter and shouts of joy. Most of the children are in the recreation room opening presents from donors. But Ethan preferred to stay alone. Alone. Of course he did. Richard also always preferred to be alone at that age. Books were safer than people. Numbers were more predictable than emotions. Margaret stopped in front of a wooden door. "Before you go in, I need you to understand something, Mr. Hartwell." Her voice became serious. "Ethan is a fragile child. He's already lost everything. If you're not sure about this, if there's any chance you'll give up halfway through, please don't go through that door." Richard felt the accusation in her words, even though Margaret didn't know the truth. "Any chance you'll give up?" Like he had given up 10 years ago. "I understand," was all he could say. Margaret nodded and opened the door. The library was small but cozy. Dark wooden shelves occupied 3 walls, filled with books organized by color. A large window let in sunlight reflecting off the snow. And there, sitting alone at a table near the window, was Ethan. The boy had a book open in front of him. Richard could see the title, A Brief History of Time, by Stephen Hawking. Too heavy for a 9-year-old child. Exactly the kind of book Richard read at that age. Ethan looked up when the door opened. For a moment, their eyes met, and Richard felt the world stop. Up close, the resemblance was even more disturbing. It wasn't just the physical features. It was the expression. The way the eyebrows furrowed slightly. The way the eyes seemed to calculate, analyze, protect. "Ethan, dear," Margaret said in a soft voice. "This is Mr. Hartwell. He came to visit you. Is that okay?" Ethan looked from Margaret to Richard, confusion clear on his face. "Why?" The question was simple, but loaded. Why would someone come visit me? Why me? Why now? "Because," Richard began, his voice coming out hoarse, "I watched your performance yesterday. And I thought, I'd like to get to know you better." Ethan kept looking at him, those green eyes, Sarah's eyes, studying every detail. "You're rich, aren't you? I saw your clothes yesterday. And your watch." Richard didn't expect that. Yes. I am. Rich people don't come here to adopt, Ethan said with brutal frankness. They send assistance. Or make donations. But they don't come personally. Margaret looked mortified. Ethan. But Richard raised his hand. No. He's right. He looked directly at the boy. You're absolutely right. And I brought presents, which probably seems even more suspicious. For the first time, something like interest sparkled in Ethan's eyes. What kind of presents? Richard placed the wrapped packages on the table. A robotics kit. Some books about astronomy. And chess. But I could be completely wrong. Maybe you hate all these things. Ethan looked at the presents, then back at Richard. How did you know? Know what? That I like these things. Robotics. Astronomy. Chess. Richard swallowed hard. Because you're my son. Because you're exactly like I was. Because when I look at you, I see myself. I got lucky, he lied. Ethan slowly opened the first present. His hands were small, careful. When he saw the robotics kit, his eyes widened. This is advanced level. For ages 12 and up. You can't do it. Ethan looked at him, and something like a challenge sparkled in his face. I can. Easy. Then prove it. It was the wrong thing to say. Or maybe the right thing. Ethan pulled up a chair, opened the box and began separating the pieces. Richard sat across from him, watching. Margaret whispered that she'd be back in an hour and left discreetly. For 10 minutes, they worked in silence. Ethan assembling, focused. Richard occasionally passing a piece when the boy looked for it. It was strange, comfortable, terrifying. Why are you really here? Ethan asked suddenly, without looking up from the robot taking shape. Richard stopped, the piece he was holding frozen in the air. What do you mean? People don't do things without a reason. Especially rich people. Especially on Christmas. Ethan finally looked up. So why are you here? Guilt? Charity? A newspaper article about how generous you are. The brutal honesty of the words cut deep. Because they were truths Richard used to hide. Guilt. Charity. Image. But not this time. Because when I saw you yesterday, Richard said slowly, choosing each word, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Something I thought had died inside me. What? Connection. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he went back to assembling the robot. My mom always said not to trust connections. That people say they feel things, but then they leave anyway. Sarah. Of course she would say that. Because of him. Your mother seemed like a wise woman, Richard said, his voice heavy. She was. The wisest in the world. Ethan stopped again, and this time Richard saw tears glisten in his eyes. She never left. Not when she was sick. Not when it got hard. She stayed. Until she couldn't anymore. Richard felt something break inside his chest. I'm sorry for your loss. Everyone is sorry. Ethan wiped his eyes abruptly. But being sorry doesn't change anything. She's still dead. I'm still here. And my father still doesn't even know I exist. The words were like knives. Your mother never talked about him? Richard asked, hating himself for the question. Only once. When she was very sick. Ethan looked out the window, at the snow. She said he was afraid. Afraid to be a father. Afraid of ruining everything. So he ran. And she let him. Because love means letting people be who they are, even when it hurts. Richard couldn't breathe. Sarah had said that. Had she forgiven? I hate her for that, Ethan continued, his voice breaking. I hate that she let him go. That she left me without a father. But also. The tears fell freely now. I also love her so much it hurts. And I don't know how to live with both things at the same time. Richard extended his hand, almost touching the boy's shoulder, but stopped halfway. No permission. No right. You don't have to choose, he finally said. Love isn't black and white. It's everything at once. Anger, pain, gratitude, longing. All together. And it's okay to feel all of that. Ethan looked at him, really looked, and Richard saw so much pain in those young eyes he could barely stand it. You understand, Ethan whispered. How do you understand? Because I'm your father. Because you're my son. Because this pain you feel, I caused it. But Richard didn't say any of that. He just held the boy's gaze and nodded. And in that moment, something passed between them. A recognition. Not of blood. Not yet. But of equally broken souls, searching for a way back to the light. The hour passed too quickly. Richard watched Ethan finish the robot with a skill that defied his age. The boy worked with methodical precision, testing each connection, adjusting each piece. Exactly like Richard did. When the robot finally moved, Ethan's eyes sparkled with a genuine joy that lasted only seconds before being quickly hidden behind his mask of indifference. It's okay, Ethan said, trying to sound disinterested. But Richard saw the pride. Saw the happiness struggling to emerge through the layers of protection that boy had built around his heart. More than okay, Richard corrected. This would take most kids' days. You did it in an hour. Ethan shrugged, but a slight blush colored his cheeks. It's not a big deal. It is. They were silent for a moment. Richard knew Margaret would be back any second. Knew this visit had a time limit. And suddenly, the idea of leaving that boy here alone, was unbearable. Can I come back? The words came out before Richard could think them through. To visit again? Ethan looked at him with suspicion. Why? Because. Richard hesitated. How to explain without revealing everything? Because it's been a long time since I had an interesting conversation. And you are interesting. Interesting, Ethan repeated, testing the word. People usually think I'm weird. Then that makes two of us. A small smile appeared at the corner of Ethan's lips. Brief, but real. And Richard felt something warm in his chest for the first time in years. The door opened and Margaret entered, her professional smile back. How did it go? Good, Ethan said quickly, already putting the robot back in the box as if afraid it would be taken from him. More than good, Richard corrected, standing up. He looked at Margaret. I'd like to make a specific donation for Ethan. Educational materials. Books. Equipment. Whatever he needs. Margaret blinked, surprised. That's very generous, Mr. Hartwell. And I'd like to come back. If Ethan allows it. All eyes turned to the boy. Ethan looked at the robot in his hands, then at Richard. There was fear in his eyes. Fear of hoping. Fear of believing. Okay, he finally said, so low it was almost inaudible. Richard left the orphanage in a state of shock. He had promised to return. Had committed himself. Something he swore he'd never do. He got in his car but didn't start the engine. Just sat there as the snow began to fall again, covering the windshield. What was he doing? This was crazy. Pure insanity. Should he confess the truth? Tell Ethan who he really was? But what if the boy hated him? What if Margaret sued him? What if? His phone rang. An unknown number. Hello, Mr. Hartwell. A female voice, professional. My name is Rachel Torres. I'm the child psychologist at St. Catherine Orphanage. Margaret asked me to call. Richard's stomach sank. Is there a problem? No. Actually, it's the opposite. Rachel paused. Ethan just came to my office. For the first time in 6 months, he initiated a conversation. And you know what he said. Richard could barely breathe. What? That maybe, just maybe, not everyone leaves. The words hit Richard like a wave. He rested his forehead on the steering wheel, fighting to maintain his composure. Mr. Hartwell, Rachel continued, her voice serious now. I don't know what you said or did today, but it was the first time I've seen that boy show hope since he arrived here. Please understand what that means. You've become something important to him. Very quickly, true, but traumatized children latch onto any light they find. I understand, Richard whispered. I hope so. Because if you change your mind, if this is just a Christmas impulse, you need to stop now. Before he gets hurt even more. Richard closed his eyes. I'm not going to change my mind. Good. Because there's something you should know about Ethan. What? He has a heart condition. It's not serious now, but he'll need surgery eventually. Maybe in a few years. His mother didn't have money for proper treatment, so she kept postponing it. And now, well, the state covers the basics, but not the best options. Richard's world spun. Heart condition. His son, because now he could no longer deny it, that was his son, had a heart problem and he didn't know. Because he never cared to know. How much? Richard asked, his voice hard. Excuse me. How much would the best treatment cost? The best medical team? Everything. Rachel hesitated. Mr. Hartwell, this isn't your responsibility. How much? Between $200,000 and $300,000. Maybe more, depending on complications. Consider it done. I want him evaluated by the best pediatric cardiologists in New York. Immediately. That's extraordinary, but we need legal authorization. Without parents or guardians, the state. Then start the proceedings for me to become his legal guardian. Silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Hartwell, Rachel said carefully. Are you talking about adoption? Was he? The word echoed in his mind. Adopt his own son. The irony was so bitter it almost choked him. I'm considering it, he said. But first, I need information. Everything about him. Complete medical history. School records. Birth certificate. Everything. That, we'll have to check with Margaret. And there are processes, background checks, home evaluations. I've made substantial donations to St. Catherine for years. I'm sure we can expedite things. Richard hung up before Rachel could respond. His hands were shaking violently now. He had just said he wanted to adopt Ethan. Adopt. He, who never wanted to be a father, who ran from responsibility 10 years ago, was now considering. No. He wasn't considering. He was deciding. Because that boy in there, with his sad eyes and hesitant smile, with his broken heart literally and figuratively, was his. Always had been. And Richard Hartwell had spent 10 years running. But not anymore. 2 days later, Richard was sitting in Margaret Ashford's office. Between them, a stack of documents. Birth certificate of Ethan Michael Brennan, Margaret said, pushing the paper toward him. Born March 14, 2014. Mother, Sarah and Brennan. Father. Richard looked at the blank space where the father's name should be. Unknown, Margaret completed. Sarah never registered the father. And before you ask, there's nothing in her records. No clue about who he was. Because she kept her promise, Richard thought. The agreement said she would never reveal my identity. And she kept it. Until the end. There's something else, Margaret said, hesitant. She pulled out another document. We found this among Sarah's belongings. A letter. Sealed. Addressed to whoever adopts Ethan. Richard felt his blood freeze. Can I see it? Technically, it should only be opened when the adoption is finalized. But given the circumstances. Margaret slid the envelope toward him. With trembling hands, Richard opened it. Sarah's handwriting filled the page. He recognized it immediately. Delicate, precise, beautiful. To whoever cares for my son, if you're reading this, it means I failed in my only mission, to protect him until he could protect himself. Ethan is everything. He is brilliant, kind, too sensitive for this cruel world. He needs someone who sees that, who protects that. He will ask questions about his father. Don't lie. But also don't judge him harshly. His father was a frightened man, incapable of loving because he was never loved properly. I tried to save him, but you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. If, by some impossible miracle, his father ever comes back, give him a chance. Not for my memory. Not out of obligation. But because Ethan deserves to know where he came from. Deserves the chance to be loved by the man who gave him life, even if that man took 10 years to find courage. Take care of him. Love him. Let him be exactly who he is. And if you do that, you will have given the world the greatest gift possible. With hope and gratitude, Sarah. Richard didn't realize he was crying until a tear fell on the paper, smudging the ink. Margaret was silent, watching. She knew, Richard whispered. Somehow, she knew I would come back. Margaret frowned, confused. Mr. Hartwell. Richard looked up, tears flowing freely now. Tears he never allowed. Pain he always buried. Truth he always ran from. I'm his father, he said. And saying it out loud for the first time, he felt as if a weight of 1,000 tons had been lifted from his shoulders. I'm Ethan's father. And I need to tell him. The silence in Margaret's office was deafening. She looked at Richard as if she were seeing a ghost. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again without making a sound. You, what? She finally managed to say. Richard wiped his face abruptly, trying to regain some composure. But it was too late. The truth was there, raw and exposed. I'm Ethan's father. I met Sarah 10 years ago. When she got pregnant, I ran. I paid her to never speak to me again. Margaret stood up abruptly, the chair scraping on the floor. You knew you had a son, and you abandoned him? Yes. There was no excuse. No justification. Just the naked, brutal truth. My God. Margaret pressed her hands against her forehead. You came here knowing? When you saw him at the concert, you already knew. No. I didn't know. Richard forced himself to look her in the eyes. Sarah kept the agreement. Never contacted me. Never asked for anything. I didn't know she had died. I didn't know Ethan existed until I saw him on that stage. And when I saw him, his voice failed. When I saw him, I knew. Margaret walked to the window, hugging herself. That boy has been searching for his father for 6 months. Has cried night after night, wishing someone would come get him. And you were here the whole time. Alive. Rich. Perfectly capable of. I know. Richard stood up, guilt crushing him. I know all that. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to fix it. You can't fix abandonment. Margaret turned abruptly. You can try to repair it. You can try to be better. But you'll never erase what you did. I know. And now, what do you plan to do? Show up and say, surprise, I'm your father, the one who abandoned you before you were born? You think he'll forgive you just like that? No. Richard took a deep breath. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But he deserves to know the truth. Deserves to choose. Choose what? Whether he wants to know me. Whether he wants me to be part of his life. Whether he wants. Richard swallowed hard. Whether he wants to give me a chance. Margaret studied him for a long moment. Have you really changed, or are you just feeling guilty? It was the question Richard had been asking himself for the last 2 days. The answer was complicated. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe both. But I know that when I look at him, I see everything that could have been and wasn't. All the wrong choices I made. And I need to do differently. Not for me. For him. Margaret sighed heavily. This is going to destroy him, you know. When he finds out you were there the whole time, that you could have prevented all his and Sarah's suffering. I know. The words were ashes in Richard's mouth. But lying would be worse. He deserves the truth. And when are you going to tell him? I don't know yet. I need him to know me first. Not as a rich stranger doing charity. But as... Richard hesitated. As what? Father. Friend. As someone who genuinely cares. Are you kidding? Margaret stared at him incredulously. You're going to manipulate the situation? Win him over first, and then drop the bomb. It's not manipulation, Richard protested. It's giving him time. Building trust before completely destroying it with the truth. Margaret's words hit home. She was right. Everything was wrong. But what else could he do? Give me 2 weeks, Richard asked. 2 weeks to be present. For him to know me. And then I'll tell him everything. Margaret crossed her arms. What if I tell him now? If I just say who you are? Richard's heart raced. Would you do that? I should. For honesty. For transparency. Margaret closed her eyes. But I won't. You know why? Why? Because in all these years running this orphanage, I've learned something. Children like Ethan need 2 things, truth and love. And sometimes, the order in which you give those things matters. She opened her eyes. If you show up now and say, I'm your father, I abandoned you, sorry, he'll never forgive you. He'll hate you before he has a chance to know you. So you agree? I don't agree with any of this. But I'll allow it. 2 weeks. You come, build a relationship. And then, no matter what happens, you tell him everything. Deal? Richard nodded. Deal. In the following days, Richard became a regular visitor at St. Catherine. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon, when Ethan finished his online classes, and stayed until 6. They worked on robotics projects, played chess, talked about books, about science, about everything and nothing. And each day, Richard saw more of himself in that boy. The way Ethan analyzed problems. How he closed up when emotions became too intense. How he used sarcasm as a defense. But he also saw Sarah. In the kindness hidden under layers of protection. In the way Ethan cared about the younger children, even while pretending indifference. In the stubborn hope that refused to die, no matter how many times it was disappointed. On the 5th day, while assembling an electrical circuit, Ethan asked the question Richard had been dreading. Why do you keep coming back? Richard stopped, the copper wire frozen in his hand. What do you mean? Everyone stops coming, eventually. At first, they think they're going to make a difference. That they're going to save an orphan child. Then they realize it's too complicated, too much work. And they stop showing up. Ethan didn't look at him, keeping his eyes on the project. So why do you keep coming back? Because you're my son. Because every second away from you is torture. Because I'm trying to make up for 10 years of absence. But Richard couldn't say that. Not yet. Because you're the most interesting person I've met in years, he said. It was true. Just not the whole truth. Interesting, Ethan repeated, testing the word. Another way of saying, weird. No. Another way of saying, real. Richard finally looked at him. Most people wear masks all the time. Pretend to be what they think they should be. You don't do that. Because it doesn't help, Ethan said bitterly. People leave anyway. I won't. Ethan finally looked up, challenge and fear in equal measure. How can you be sure? Because you're my blood. Because your heart beats with my DNA. Because leaving you once almost destroyed me, and I wouldn't survive doing it again. Because for the first time in my life, Richard said carefully, I found something that matters more than money, power, or control. I found purpose. Ethan studied him for a long moment. You're weird too, you know? Richard felt a smile, a real smile, appear on his face. Yes, I know. They went back to work, and in the comfortable silence that followed, Richard felt something he had never experienced before. Peace. But peace was fragile. And time was running out. On the 10th day, Richard was playing chess with Ethan when the boy made an unexpected move with the queen, sacrificing her to open a devastating attack. My mom taught me this, Ethan said softly, looking at the board. She said that sometimes you have to lose something precious to gain something essential. Richard looked at the boy, his son, and knew time was running out. He had to tell him. Soon. Before Ethan got hurt even more. Before the truth became an even bigger betrayal. But when he looked at those green eyes finally showing a little joy, a little hope, courage failed him. One more day, he thought. Just one more day. But every day was a lie. And every lie made the truth harder to tell. Richard was trapped in a trap of his own making. And time was running out. On the 12th day, everything changed. Richard arrived at St. Catherine as always, at 3 in the afternoon. But when he entered, the silence was different. Heavy, tense. Margaret met him in the hallway, her face pale. Where's Ethan? Richard asked immediately, his heart racing. Infirmary. He had an episode during gym class. Chest pain, difficulty breathing. Margaret held his arm. The paramedics said it's the heart condition. He needs the surgery sooner than we thought. Richard's world tilted. Where is he? I need to see him. Richard, you're not technically. Where is he? Margaret guided him to a small room on the 2nd floor. Ethan was lying in a narrow bed, connected to a heart monitor. His face was pale, his lips slightly blue. But his eyes were open. When he saw Richard, something passed across his face. Relief. You came, Ethan whispered. Richard approached, his legs barely supporting him. Of course I came. How are you feeling? Like my chest is going to explode. Ethan tried to smile, but it was a weak caricature. But it passed. I guess it'll always be like this until the surgery. Richard pulled up a chair, sitting beside the bed. His hands were shaking. Seeing that boy, his son, like this, fragile and frightened, was more than he could bear. Did the doctors say anything? That I need surgery soon. But that it's expensive. Very expensive. Ethan looked at the ceiling. The state will pay eventually, but the waiting list is long. And the longer I wait, the riskier it gets. No, Richard said with a firmness that surprised them both. You'll have the surgery. The best surgeons. The best hospital. It's already arranged. Ethan turned his head sharply to look at him. What? But, how? It doesn't matter how. All that matters is that you'll be okay. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. Why? Why would you do this for me? You don't even really know me. Because you're my son. Because your heart carries half my DNA. Because every irregular beat is my fault for not being there from the beginning. I know you enough, Richard said, his voice hoarse. And you deserve to live. You deserve every chance. Ethan wiped his eyes quickly, as if embarrassed by the tears. No one has ever. I mean, my mom did everything for me, but she was my mom. You're. What? I don't know. A stranger who cares. It's weird. Ethan let out a weak laugh. But it's good. Weird and good at the same time. Richard felt the weight of the lie crushing him. He wasn't a stranger. He was the father. The father who abandoned. The father who let Sarah fight cancer alone while caring for a sick child. Ethan, Richard began, knowing he had to tell him now, that he couldn't delay anymore. But Ethan interrupted him. You know what I thought when the pain started? When I thought I was going to die there, on the court. What? That at least you would be sad. That at least someone besides the nuns would miss me. More tears fell now. It's pathetic, isn't it? Getting attached like this to someone I've known for less than 2 weeks. Richard couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Could only feel the absolute pain of knowing that this boy, alone, frightened, sick, had found comfort in him. In the man who had hurt him before he was even born. It's not pathetic, Richard said, taking Ethan's small hand. It was the first time they had touched beyond passing robotics pieces. The boy's hand was cold, trembling. It's human. It's real. And yes, I would miss you. More than you can imagine. Ethan squeezed his hand with surprising strength. Promise you won't disappear? Even after the surgery. Even when I get better. Tell him. Now. Tell him who you are. But looking at that pale face, those eyes pleading for security, Richard couldn't. Not at that moment. Not when Ethan was so vulnerable. I promise, he said. And he knew it was another lie. Because when the truth came out, it would be Ethan who would disappear. It would be Ethan who would hate him and banish him from his life. As he should. That night, Richard sat with Margaret in her office. I need to start the adoption proceedings. Officially. Margaret looked at him over her glasses. Your 2 weeks aren't up yet. I can't wait. He needs the surgery. He needs stability. He needs... Richard ran his hand through his hair. He needs a father. And I'm his. Biologically, Margaret said dryly. But legally, emotionally. Are you prepared to be rejected when you tell him the truth? No. But I'll do it anyway. Margaret sighed, opening a drawer and pulling out a thick folder. Adoption documents. I'll need references, background checks, psychological evaluation, home inspection. Do everything. As fast as possible. And when are you going to tell him? Richard looked out the window. Outside, snow was falling again. After the surgery. When he's stronger. When? When you have the courage. When he has the best chance of surviving the blow. The next few days were a fog of doctors, paperwork, and stolen moments with Ethan. The boy was weaker, the episodes happening more frequently. But every time Richard appeared, his eyes would light up. Brought this for you, Richard said on the 15th day, handing over a new tablet. It has all the books you mentioned wanting to read. And some educational games. For when you're recovering from surgery. Ethan held the device as if it were made of gold. You didn't have to. I know. But I wanted to. Why? Ethan asked for the 1000th time. Why do you do all this for me? And this time, Richard decided to give a truth. Not the whole truth. But a part of it. Because when I was your age, I was alone too. My father was difficult. Cruel, actually. And I swore that if I ever had the chance to make a difference in the life of a child who felt like I felt, I would. It wasn't a lie. Just incomplete. Ethan processed this. Did you have children? The air left Richard's lungs. What? You said, if I ever had the chance. So did you. Children. Yes. One. You. It's complicated, Richard finally said. Complicated how? Complicated like. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. That haunt me every day. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that completely destroyed Richard. My mom always said that mistakes only define you if you don't try to fix them. That it's never too late to choose differently. Sarah. Always Sarah, teaching kindness and forgiveness that Richard didn't deserve. Your mother was wise, Richard said, his voice breaking. She was. Ethan looked at the tablet, then back at Richard. I think she would have liked you. She always said she saw goodness in people, even when they didn't see it in themselves. Richard had to leave the room. He mumbled an excuse about an important call and practically ran to the hallway. He leaned against the wall, fighting to breathe. Sarah would see goodness in him? After everything he did? No. Impossible. But she had written that letter. Had said to give him a chance. Even after everything. How could she forgive the unforgivable? Mr. Hartwell. Rachel Torres's voice pulled him from his thoughts. The psychologist approached, a concerned expression on her face. Is everything all right? No, Richard admitted. Nothing is all right. The surgery is scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Will you be there? Of course. And after? Are you going to tell him? Richard closed his eyes. Yes. After he recovers. I'll tell him everything. Are you prepared for the possibility that he'll never forgive you? No. But I'll do it anyway. Because he deserves the truth. And I deserve the consequences. Rachel placed her hand on his shoulder. For what it's worth, I think you've changed. Really. I see how you look at him. How you care. That counts for something. Does it? For some people, yes. For Ethan. She sighed. We'll find out. Richard returned to the room where Ethan was. The boy looked up from the tablet, smiling, a real, genuine smile. Hey, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I have. The ghost of who I was. And the ghost of who I'll never be. I'm fine, Richard lied. Just tired. Want to play chess? I can let you win this time. Richard let out a laugh that was half a sob. You've never let me win. True. Ethan smiled mischievously. But maybe today I feel sorry for you. And there, in that moment, playing chess with his son who didn't know he was his son, Richard Hartwell knew the truth. He loved that boy. Completely. Unconditionally. In a way he never imagined he could. And that love made the truth even more impossible. But impossible or not, it had to be said. Soon. The day of the surgery dawned cold and gray. Richard hadn't slept. He spent the entire night in his apartment, looking at the city, trying to find courage for what would come after. At 6 a.m, he was at Mount Sinai Hospital, where the best pediatric cardiac surgeons in the country were waiting. Richard had personally ensured that Ethan would have everything. The best team. The best technology. The best chance. Ethan was brought from the orphanage at 7. He was pale, nervous, wearing a hospital gown that was too big. When he saw Richard waiting in the pre-op room, something in his face calmed. You came, Ethan said, his voice small. I promised I would. I always come. Ethan sat on the gurney, swinging his legs. His hands trembled slightly. I'm scared. Richard approached, sitting beside him. Me too. But you're not even the one being operated on. No. But you are. And that terrifies me. Ethan looked at him, surprised. Why? I mean, I know you care, but why so much? Because you're my son. Because if something happens to you, I'll die too. Because I already lost you once and I can't lose you again. Because you've become important to me, Richard said, choosing his words carefully. Very important. And the idea of something happening to you is unbearable. Ethan completed. Yes. Exactly that. Ethan was quiet for a moment, processing. Then he asked the question Richard had been dreading. Are you doing all this because you want to adopt me? Richard's heart stopped. What? I heard Margaret talking to Rachel. About adoption papers. About you wanting to be my. Ethan swallowed hard. My father. Richard couldn't breathe. He couldn't lie. Not anymore. But he also couldn't tell the whole truth there, now, minutes before surgery. Yes, he finally said. I'm considering it. If you want. Tears filled Ethan's eyes. No one has ever wanted to adopt me before. No one. Then they were all idiots. Ethan let out a wet laugh. But what if you change your mind? What if after the surgery, when I'm better, you realize it was just pity? That you don't really want me? Richard took the boy's face in his hands, forcing him to look into his eyes. Listen carefully. This isn't pity. This isn't charity. This is... The truth pressed against his lips. This is guilt. This is redemption. This is desperate love for a son I abandoned. This is real. You understand. Real. Promise. Ethan whispered. Even when you know everything about me. Even when I'm annoying or difficult or... I promise. It was another lie. Because when Ethan knew everything about Richard, he would be the one who would run away. The nurse entered. Time to go, dear. We're going to take very good care of you. Ethan held Richard's hand tightly. Will you be here when I wake up? I'll be here. I promise. And after the surgery, will we be a family? The word hit Richard like a bullet. Family. Something he never had. Something he destroyed before it began. Yes, he said, his voice breaking. If you'll have me. Ethan hugged him then. Quick. Desperate. Richard held him back, feeling that small body trembling against his son. Finally, in his arms. Finally. I love you, Ethan whispered so low that Richard almost didn't hear. The world stopped. Richard couldn't respond. The words were stuck in his throat, suffocated by guilt and pain and a love so intense it was almost violent. The nurse gently separated Ethan. Let's go, dear. The sooner we start, the sooner you'll be back with him. Ethan waved as he was taken away, his eyes glued to Richard until he disappeared down the corridors. And Richard stood there, alone, Ethan's words echoing in his mind. I love you. 3 words. 3 simple words that completely destroyed what remained of his defenses. He sank into a waiting room chair, burying his face in his hands. Margaret had come and sat beside him in silence. He loves you, she finally said. I know. It will destroy him when he knows the truth. I know. Then why haven't you told him yet? Richard lifted his head. His eyes were red. Because I'm a coward. Always have been. And I still am. Or, Margaret said gently, because you love him too. And love makes us protect, even when we should be honest. This isn't love. It's selfishness. It can be both. The surgery lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of hell where Richard walked the corridors, unable to sit still. Every minute was torture. Every second, an eternity. He prayed. For the first time since childhood, Richard Hartwell prayed. To a God he wasn't sure he believed in. To the universe. To Sarah, wherever she was. Please. Save him. Take everything from me, but save my son. At 5 in the afternoon, the surgeon finally appeared. The surgery was a success. He's stable. He'll recover completely. Richard almost fainted with relief. Can I see him? He's still in recovery. But in an hour, yes. That hour was the longest of Richard's life. When they finally let him into the pediatric ICU, his heart was in his throat. Ethan was pale, tubes and wires connected to him, but his eyes were open. When he saw Richard, he tried to smile. You stayed, he said, his voice weak. Richard approached, taking his hand. I always stay. It hurt. A lot. I know. But it's over. You were very brave. I didn't feel brave. I felt scared. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing it anyway. Richard squeezed his hand gently. And you did. Ethan closed his eyes, exhausted. Do you still want to adopt me? Even now that you've seen how problematic I am? How I need expensive surgery and... especially now. Why? Because you're my son. Because every beat of your repaired heart is my reason for living. Because failing you once was the biggest mistake of my life and I won't fail again. Because you deserve someone who stays, Richard said simply. And I want to be that person. Ethan opened his eyes again. Even when I know your secrets. Because everyone has secrets. Richard's stomach turned. What? You said you made terrible mistakes. That haunt you. Ethan studied him. What mistakes? This was the moment. This was now. Richard could tell everything. Should tell everything. But looking at that boy lying in a hospital bed, still fragile, still recovering, he couldn't. Mistakes I'll tell you about, Richard said. Soon. When you're stronger. I promise I'll tell you everything. Will it be bad? Yes. Will it change how you feel about me? No. But it might change how you feel about me. Ethan was quiet, processing. I don't think anything could do that. You saved me. Literally and figuratively. I didn't save you. I abandoned you first. And when you know that, you'll hate me. A nurse entered. Sorry, sir, but he needs to rest now. You can come back tomorrow. Richard nodded, standing up. But Ethan held his hand with surprising strength. Promise you'll come back. I promise. Promise you won't leave when you know my worst fears and nightmares? I promise. Promise we'll be a real family? Richard felt tears burn his eyes. I promise. Ethan smiled, a real smile, tired but happy, and closed his eyes. Richard left the hospital like a condemned man. Because every promise he made was another lie. Not because he didn't want to keep them, but because when the truth came out, it would be Ethan who would break all the promises. It would be Ethan who would run away. And Richard would have to let him go. Because it was what he deserved. Outside, the snow had stopped. The sky was clear, full of stars. And somewhere up there, Richard imagined Sarah looking down, judging him. Tell him. He could almost hear her say. Before it's too late. But Richard was an expert at doing things too late. Always had been. A week after surgery, Ethan was discharged from the hospital. The doctors were impressed with his recovery. He's a strong boy, they said. He'll live a completely normal life now. Richard was there to pick him up. He had prepared everything. A room at the orphanage specially renovated for Ethan's recovery. New books. A telescope to observe the stars. Everything the boy could want. But he had also brought something else. A small wooden box. Inside, Sarah's letters. Ethan's birth certificate. The documents Richard had signed 10 years ago, renouncing his rights. It was time. He couldn't delay anymore. I need to talk to you, Richard said when they arrived at the orphanage. Something important. Ethan, still moving slowly because of the surgery, nodded. About the adoption. Margaret said the papers are almost ready. About more than that. They went to the library, the place where it all began. Richard closed the door. His hands were shaking so much he almost dropped the box. You're scaring me, Ethan said, trying to laugh but unable to hide the concern in his voice. Richard sat across from him. Took a deep breath. There's no easy way. Just truth. Remember when you asked about my mistakes? About the secrets that haunt me? Ethan nodded slowly. Well, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago. From the first day. Richard opened the box, taking out the birth certificate. Your full name is Ethan Michael Brennan. I know that. And your father isn't listed. Sarah never said who he was. Ethan's expression became tense. Why are we talking about this? Because. The words stuck in his throat. Richard forced himself to continue. Because I know who your father is. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at him, confusion clear in his eyes. How do you know? Because, Richard said, each word feeling like swallowing glass, I'm him. I'm your father, Ethan. The world stopped. Ethan blinked. Once. Twice. As if processing the words but unable to comprehend them. What? I met your mother 10 years ago. Sarah Brennan. We had a brief relationship and she got pregnant. But Richard's voice failed. I didn't want to be a father. I paid her to never contact me again. I signed documents renouncing all my rights. And then, I never looked back. The color drained from Ethan's face. He stood up abruptly, almost stumbling. You're lying. I'm not. You're lying. Ethan's voice cracked. This doesn't make sense. You appeared out of nowhere. You cared. I didn't know you existed, Richard said quickly. Your mother never told me. She kept the agreement. Until I saw you on that stage, I had no idea. Ethan backed up, leaning against the bookshelf. His hands gripped the wood as if he needed support to keep from falling. You saw my face and you knew? Yes. And still you didn't tell me? You kept coming here, pretending, lying. I wanted you to know me first. Not as the man who abandoned you, but as what? Ethan shouted, tears streaming down his face. As someone good? As someone who cares? You don't care. If you cared, you would have stayed. You would have helped my mother when she was dying. The words hit Richard like punches. I didn't know she was sick. I didn't. You didn't know because you didn't care to know. Ethan was sobbing now, his whole body shaking. She worked 2 jobs. Fought cancer alone. Raised me alone. All while you were in your luxury penthouse, in your perfect life, pretending we didn't exist. You're right, Richard said, tears streaming down his own face. You're absolutely right. There's no excuse. No justification. Then why? Ethan screamed. Why did you do this to her? To her. Because I was afraid. My father was a monster. He hurt me in ways I never got over. And I swore I'd never be a father because I was sure I'd be just like him. So when Sarah said she was pregnant, I panicked and you ran. Ethan finished, his voice empty now. Like a coward. Yes. Like a coward. Ethan stared at him, and Richard saw everything in those eyes. Betrayal. Pain. Anger. And worse. Disappointment. I loved you, Ethan whispered. In the operating room, I told you I loved you. And you knew. You knew who you were, and you let me say that. Ethan. And all those times I asked if you were going to stay, if you weren't going to abandon me, you knew. You knew you had already abandoned me. And still you let me believe. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't change anything. Ethan screamed. Sorry doesn't bring my mother back. Sorry doesn't erase 10 years of struggle. Sorry doesn't. He stopped abruptly, grabbing his chest. The surgery. He was still recovering. Richard stood up quickly. Ethan, please, calm down. Your heart. Don't touch me. Ethan recoiled violently. You don't have the right to touch me anymore. You never did. You're right. But please, just breathe. I don't want you to hurt yourself. You don't care if I hurt myself, Ethan said, his voice breaking. If you cared, you would have been there from the beginning. Richard felt something inside him break completely. I care now. I know it doesn't change the past, but now. Ethan laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Now, after my mother is dead? After I've already suffered everything I had to suffer? Now you decide to care. I know it's too late. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But you need to know that I've changed. Seeing you, Knowing you made me realize. Realize what? That maybe you should have been a father. Ethan wiped his face abruptly. Well, it's too late. You had your chance. My mother gave you a chance. And you chose money. You chose your perfect life. My life was never perfect. It was empty, lonely, meaningless. Good. Ethan shouted. I hope it was miserable. I hope every day hurt. Because that's what you did to her. That's what you did to me. Margaret burst through the door, alerted by the shouting. What's happening here? Ask him, Ethan said, pointing at Richard. Ask my father. Margaret looked from one to the other, understanding slowly forming on her face. You told him. He lied, Ethan said, his voice now frighteningly calm. From the first day. Everything was a lie. Not everything, Richard tried. My feelings, my concern, everything I felt was real. I don't care, Ethan said. And in the words, Richard heard something worse than anger. He heard indifference. I want you to leave. Ethan, please. Leave. The scream tore through the air. Leave and never come back. I don't want your adoption. I don't want your money. I don't want you. Richard took a step toward him, but Margaret held him back. I think you'd better leave, she said gently. Now. I can't leave him like this. You don't have a choice. He asked you to go. You have to respect that. Richard looked at Ethan, his son, his boy, broken for the second time by the same person. I'm sorry, he said once more, knowing it was useless. For everything. Ethan turned his back on him. His shoulders shook with silent sobs. And Richard Hartwell, the man who never cried, who never showed weakness, left that library with tears streaming freely down his face. He had lost his son. For the second time. But this time, the pain was 1,000 times worse. Because this time, he knew exactly what he was losing. Richard didn't go home that night. He drove aimlessly through the streets of New York, the snow falling again, covering the city with a purity he would never feel again. He ended up parking in front of Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Even at 11 at night, he entered, using his influence to convince the guard to let him through. It took an hour to find the grave. Simple. Modest. Sarah and Brennan. 1995 to 2024. Beloved mother. Richard fell to his knees in the snow in front of the headstone. I ruined everything, he said to the cold stone. Again. You gave me a second chance and I ruined everything. The silence of the cemetery was absolute. He loved you so much, Richard continued, sobs tearing at his throat. And you deserved that love. Deserved everything. And I took from him the only thing he still had. Hope. The snow kept falling. Silent. Relentless. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can. But I promise. His voice broke completely. I promise I'll try. Even if he never forgives me. Even if he hates me forever. I'll make sure he has everything he needs. Education. Security. A future. Richard stayed there for hours, until the cold penetrated his bones and he could no longer feel his fingers. When he finally stood up, he left something on the grave. The wooden box. Inside, all the documents. And a letter. The first honest letter Richard Hartwell had written in his life. 3 weeks passed. Richard kept his silent promise. He created a trust fund in Ethan's name. $5 million for education, housing, anything he needed. He sent everything through lawyers, without his name attached. He also hired the best private tutors for Ethan. Paid for therapy with the best child psychologists. All anonymously. All without asking for anything in return. And every night he cried. Alone in his empty penthouse, Richard Hartwell finally felt the full weight of his choices. On the 23rd day, Margaret called. He wants to see you, she said without preamble. Richard's heart stopped. What? Ethan. He wants to see you. But there are conditions. Anything. He wants you to listen. Just listen. No interruptions. No excuses. No explanations. He'll talk, and you'll listen. Can you do that? Yes. And Richard, don't get your hopes up. This isn't forgiveness. It's closure. They met in the library again. Ethan was sitting at the same table where they built the first robot. But he looked different. Older. More tired. Richard sat across from him, his hands shaking. I spent 3 weeks hating you, Ethan began, his voice controlled. Every night, lying in bed, imagining all the ways to hurt you like you hurt me. Richard nodded, accepting. But then Rachel, my therapist, made me do an exercise. She gave me my mother's letters. All of them. Including one she left for me. To be opened when I turned 18. But Rachel thought I should read it now. Ethan pulled out a yellowed envelope. His hand trembled. Want to know what she said? About you. Richard could barely breathe. Yes. She said you were a broken man. That your father destroyed you in ways she never fully understood. That when you ran, it wasn't because you didn't love us, but because you didn't know how to love. Ethan wiped his eyes. She said she forgave you. The day she found out she was pregnant, she forgave you. Because true love means letting people be who they are, even when it hurts. Richard felt tears burn his eyes. And she made me promise something. She made me promise that if you ever came back, if you ever had the courage to show up, I would give you the chance she gave. The chance to change. To be better. Ethan. I'm not finished. The boy's voice was firm now. She also said that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean the pain disappears. It just means you choose not to let that pain define who you are. Ethan looked directly at Richard. So I'm going to give you the chance she asked for. But you need to understand something. I'm not going to call you Dad. Maybe I never will. I'm not going to pretend everything is okay. Because it's not. You hurt me. You hurt my mother. And that doesn't disappear with apologies or money. I know, Richard whispered. But I also know you've changed. I see it. Rachel sees it. Even Margaret sees it. And my mother believed in second chances. Even for people who don't deserve them. Ethan slid a paper across the table. Richard looked down. It was the adoption documents. I signed, Ethan said. Not because I've completely forgiven you. Not because I trust you. But because my mother was right. Everyone deserves the chance to be better. Even you. Richard couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Tears fell freely now. But there are rules, Ethan continued. Therapy. For both of us. Together and separately. Total honesty. No more lies. Never again. And time. I need time to process all this. To learn to accept you. I understand, Richard finally managed to say. And, Ethan, thank you. Thank you for this chance. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve it. I know. Ethan gave a small sad smile. Because if you don't, I'll kick you out of my life so fast your head will spin. My mother believed in second chances. Not third ones. Richard let out a laugh that was half a sob. Fair. 6 months later Richard was in the kitchen of his penthouse, now renovated to include a full bedroom for Ethan, making pancakes. Badly. Very badly. That's burned, Ethan said, entering the kitchen in his new school uniform. It's crispy, Richard corrected. Burned. Crispy. Ethan rolled his eyes, but there was a small smile on his lips. In the last few months, they had found a rhythm. Difficult. Complicated. But real. There were still bad days. Days when Ethan yelled at Richard about small things because the anger about the big thing still hadn't disappeared. Days when Richard hated himself so much he could barely look in the mirror. But there were also good days. Days of chess and robotics. Days of conversations about Sarah, where Ethan shared memories and Richard finally learned about the extraordinary woman who raised his son alone. "We have therapy at 4, Ethan reminded him, grabbing a pancake, burned. "I know. I already cancelled my meetings." "Good." Ethan chewed thoughtfully. "We're going to talk about Father's Day next week." Richard froze. "Oh. Yeah. Oh." Ethan looked at him. "I still don't know if I'll call you Dad. But Margaret suggested that maybe we could go to the cemetery together. Visit my mom. Both of us." Richard's heart tightened. "You want me to go?" "Yes." Ethan looked away. "I think she'd like to know we're trying." "I'd love to go." They ate in comfortable silence. Afterward, Richard drove Ethan to school. Before getting out of the car, Ethan hesitated. "Hey," he said, without looking at Richard. "Just so you know, I'm still angry. It still hurts. But I'm glad you came back. Even though it took 10 years. And then he got out, leaving Richard sitting there, tears streaming down his face for the 1,000th time. But this time, they were different tears. They were tears of hope. 5 years later, Ethan was 14 now. Tall, confident, brilliant. He went to the best school in New York. Had friends. Had dreams. Had a future. And he had a father. Not perfect. Not without scars. But present. Trying. Every day, trying. "Ready for graduation?" Richard asked, adjusting Ethan's tie. "It's just 8th grade. It's not a big deal." "It is to me." Ethan rolled his eyes, but he was smiling. "You're so dramatic. Learned from the best." In the school auditorium, Richard sat in the front row. When Ethan went up on stage to receive an academic honor medal, the pride Richard felt was so intense it hurt. Afterward, taking photos, Ethan said casually, "Hey, Dad, you're crying again." Richard froze. "Dad." It was the first time. In 5 years. The first time Ethan had called him that. You called me." "Don't make it a whole thing," Ethan said quickly, his cheeks flushing. "It just slipped out." But his eyes said differently. They said it was intentional. That it was choice. Richard pulled Ethan into a hug. "Thank you," he whispered. "For giving me this chance. For letting me be your father, even when I didn't deserve it." "You still don't deserve it," Ethan said against his shoulder. "But you're getting close." And there, in the parking lot of a school in Manhattan, Richard Hartwell finally understood what Sarah had tried to teach. That love isn't perfection. It's effort. It's choice. It's showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when you mess up. It's forgiving the unforgivable. It's giving chances when there's no reason to give them. It's believing people can change, even when everything says otherwise. And sometimes, just sometimes, miracles happen. Not the way you expect. Not in the time you want. But when they do, they're worth every tear, every pain, every moment of waiting. Richard looked at the sky, where he imagined Sarah looking down, and whispered, "Thank you. For him. For everything. For giving me the chance I never deserved." And somewhere, he swore he felt her smile. If this story of redemption, regret, and second chances moved you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch the heart. Which part moved you the most? Comment below. And don't forget to binge other amazing stories here on the channel. Write in the comments where you're watching this story from. Thank you for watching until the end. May the story of Ethan and Richard remind us that it's never too late to choose love.